The monsoon rain hammered against the roof of the small house as though the sky itself were grieving. Inside, 26-year-old Anaya Rao sat alone beside a dying oil lamp, listening to the storm and the silence it could not fill. 6 months earlier, she had buried her father beneath a banyan tree overlooking the river. 3 months after that, she had buried her mother beside him. The house that had once echoed with laughter, stories, and evening prayers now felt impossibly vast. Every room carried a memory. Every shadow reminded her of someone she loved and could never speak to again. For weeks she moved through her days like a ghost, sorting possessions she could not bear to touch and preserving belongings she could not afford to lose. Her parents had never been wealthy, but they had possessed dignity, education, and a quiet pride that no hardship had ever stolen. Those were the things Anaya clung to as the future narrowed around her. One evening, while clearing her father's study, she noticed a loose wooden plank beneath an old bookshelf. Curiosity overcame exhaustion. Kneeling on the floor, she pried the board loose and uncovered a small iron key wrapped in yellowed cloth. The discovery led her to an old cedar chest hidden in a storage room she rarely entered. The lock clicked open. Inside lay dozens of carefully preserved letters tied with ribbon, official documents bearing English seals, birth records, legal certificates, and a faded portrait unlike anything she had ever seen. In the photograph, an elegant English gentleman stood beside a beautiful Indian woman. Their hands were intertwined. Their expressions carried the confidence of people who loved each other despite the world around them. Anaya spent the entire night reading. By dawn she understood why her father had guarded the chest so carefully. Decades earlier, an English nobleman had secretly married an Indian woman. Their union had scandalized powerful relatives who feared disgrace more than injustice. The couple had been erased from family records, their descendants pushed aside, their names spoken only in private letters. Yet the marriage had been legal. Every document proved it. Anaya's hands trembled as she reached the final pages. Her father had been the legitimate grandson of that forgotten union, and she possessed lawful claims connecting her to a distant branch of an aristocratic English family. The revelation felt unreal. Her entire life had been built upon a history she had never known existed. For the first time since her parents died, hope flickered inside her. Then someone else learned the truth. Rajan Malhotra was among the wealthiest businessmen in the region, a man whose influence stretched from trading houses to government offices. He was nearly twice Anaya's age and accustomed to getting whatever he desired. When rumors of her inheritance reached him, fascination quickly turned into obsession. His proposal arrived within days. Anaya refused immediately. His smile never changed. Instead, his methods did. Officials who had always treated her fairly suddenly delayed paperwork. Bank representatives froze access to family funds. Lawyers refused appointments. Friends became distant. Merchants stopped extending credit. One obstacle appeared after another until the pattern became impossible to ignore. Rajan was closing every door around her. Weeks later she discovered something even worse. A marriage agreement had been drafted without her consent. The realization struck her with terrifying clarity. He did not want her affection. He wanted her future inheritance. If he married her, every claim she possessed would eventually become his. Anaya spent several sleepless nights weighing impossible choices. Surrender meant losing herself. Resistance might cost everything. On a stormy night, as rain lashed the windows and thunder rolled across the countryside, she made her decision. She packed a single suitcase. Into it she placed the documents, the faded portrait, several changes of clothing, and her mother's silver locket. Nothing else mattered. Under cover of darkness, she slipped through a rear window and disappeared into the rain. The journey to the harbor felt endless. Mud clung to her shoes. Wind tore at her shawl. More than once she feared footsteps behind her. Yet dawn found her standing among cargo crates and fishing vessels while waves crashed against the docks. That was where she met Captain Thomas Whitmore. The weathered sea captain listened quietly as she explained her situation. He studied the documents, the fear in her eyes, and the determination beneath it. At last he nodded. "My ship leaves for England before sunset," he said. "If you're willing to work and stay hidden when necessary, I'll help you." Tears blurred Anaya's vision. By nightfall she was aboard. The voyage stretched across endless weeks of gray water and uncertain horizons. She scrubbed decks, assisted in the galley, and spent countless evenings staring toward distant sunsets. Some nights she imagined her parents watching over her. Other nights fear whispered that she was sailing toward another rejection. Still she never turned back. When England finally emerged from the mist, its cliffs glowing pale beneath the morning sun, Anaya felt her heart race with cautious hope. The feeling lasted less than a week. The relatives connected to her father's lineage received her coldly. Society proved even worse. Noblewomen mocked her clothing. Gentlemen laughed at her accent. Invitations vanished the moment she entered a room. Again and again she heard the same cruel sentence delivered with polished smiles. Blood may be English, but you will never be one of us. Each insult wounded her, yet none broke her. She rented a modest room, guarded her documents carefully, and refused to beg for acceptance. If England wished to judge her, it would do so on its own terms. But as she stood alone one evening outside a glittering ballroom filled with the very people who despised her, she noticed a tall aristocrat watching from an upper window. Unlike the others, he was not laughing. The man watching from the ballroom window was Duke Alexander Ashford. At 34, he possessed everything society admired and almost nothing it understood. Newspapers praised his intelligence. Parliament respected his judgment. Landowners envied his fortune. Mothers with unmarried daughters spoke his name with carefully disguised ambition. He was one of England's most eligible noblemen, heir to generations of prestige and responsibility. Yet the admiration surrounding him often felt hollow. Most people saw the title before they saw the man. That evening, while musicians played beneath crystal chandeliers and aristocrats filled the ballroom with polished laughter, Alexander's attention remained fixed on the lone woman standing outside. She did not belong there. Or rather, everyone believed she did not. Anaya Rao stood near the entrance in a simple but elegant dress. Conversations quieted whenever she passed. Smiles sharpened. Whispers followed her through every room. She carried herself with remarkable composure, yet Alexander recognized the exhaustion hidden beneath her calm expression. He had seen pride before. What interested him was dignity. There was a difference. Pride demanded recognition. Dignity survived without it. As the evening progressed, several noble women deliberately excluded Anaya from their conversations. A group of gentlemen openly mocked her accent after she answered a question. Others stared as though she were a curiosity imported from some distant exhibition rather than a human being. Anaya endured it all without complaint. She neither retreated nor argued. She simply remained. Alexander found himself watching her more than the event itself. The gala had been organized to raise funds for veterans and struggling workers. England's wealthiest families had gathered beneath painted ceilings and glittering chandeliers to celebrate their generosity. Yet Alexander had attended enough such events to recognize the difference between charity and performance. Many came to be seen. Very few came to help. Near midnight, a sudden commotion interrupted the music. An elderly servant carrying a tray stumbled beside the central staircase. The silver platter slipped from his trembling hands. Glass shattered across the marble floor. The old man collapsed. For one brief moment, silence spread through the ballroom. Then came movement. Not toward him. Away from him. Several ladies stepped back to protect expensive gowns. Gentlemen frowned at the disturbance. One woman complained about broken glass near her shoes. Another instructed a footman to clean the mess. Nobody knelt. Nobody touched him. Nobody seemed willing to sacrifice comfort for compassion. Then Alexander saw Anaya move. Without hesitation, she crossed the crowded floor. Ignoring startled stares, she knelt beside the servant and gently lifted his head. She folded her shawl beneath him to provide support and spoke softly while checking his breathing. The old man's frightened expression gradually eased. Anaya remained beside him until a physician arrived. Only then did she stand. The ballroom resumed breathing. Yet something had changed. Alexander could not look away. He had spent years surrounded by people who spoke endlessly about virtue. Few demonstrated it when nobody expected applause. Anaya had. The image followed him long after the gala ended. Over the following weeks, curiosity evolved into determination. Alexander instructed a trusted investigator to examine Anaya's background. He expected to uncover an ordinary story wrapped in unusual circumstances. Instead, each report deepened his interest. He learned about the death of her parents. He learned about the hidden documents. He learned about her escape from India. He learned about the businessman who had attempted to control her future. Most surprising of all, he discovered countless examples of quiet kindness. She volunteered at a church kitchen despite having little money herself. She spent afternoons teaching immigrant children how to read. She visited elderly patients at hospitals where nobody else came. Not once did she seek recognition. Not once did she mention her inheritance. Alexander found himself increasingly unsettled. The more he learned, the more she contradicted everything society claimed about her. Eventually curiosity demanded a conversation. Their first meeting occurred in a library. The second lasted longer. The third stretched across an entire afternoon. Anaya possessed intelligence sharpened by adversity and humor untouched by bitterness. She challenged his assumptions without disrespect. She listened carefully before speaking. She carried grief within her, yet refused to let sorrow define her future. For the first time in years, Alexander enjoyed being understood. Weeks became months. Their friendship deepened. Predictably, England noticed. Rumors multiplied with astonishing speed. Newspapers speculated endlessly. Noble families grew alarmed. Several influential mothers increased pressure on their daughters to secure Alexander's attention before it was too late. The daughters themselves became openly hostile. Anaya was suddenly excluded from gatherings she had never wanted to attend. Invitations vanished. Whispers intensified. The hostility only confirmed what Alexander already suspected. Society feared her because she exposed its hypocrisy. One rainy afternoon, while walking through the estate gardens, Alexander stopped beside a fountain and made a decision. He was tired of allowing others to dictate his future. When he asked Anaya to marry him, silence followed. Not because she lacked an answer. Because she understood the consequences. Accepting would place her at the center of a storm unlike anything she had yet endured. Alexander understood that as well. Still, neither retreated. The engagement was announced 3 days later. England erupted. Newspapers published outraged editorials. Drawing rooms buzzed with scandal. Political figures privately warned Alexander he was making a mistake. Even members of his extended family expressed concern. Yet nothing compared to the engagement ball. Hundreds of nobles gathered beneath golden chandeliers, eager to witness the spectacle. Anaya entered beside Alexander wearing a deep crimson gown that reflected both her heritage and her new future. Every eye followed her. The first laugh came from the far side of the ballroom. Then another. Then dozens more. Soon the entire room seemed alive with amusement. Women covered smiles behind jeweled fans. Men exchanged mocking glances. The cruelty was so open it no longer bothered pretending to be polite. Anaya felt every stare. Alexander felt every insult. Neither lowered their head. At last a prominent nobleman raised his glass high enough for everyone to hear him. His voice echoed across the ballroom. An Indian girl could never be a duchess. Laughter exploded beneath the chandeliers. Yet as the crowd celebrated its cruelty, Alexander remained perfectly still. His expression did not change. His hand tightened around Anaya's. And deep within his private study, hidden from every noble family in England, rested a collection of forgotten letters containing a truth so powerful that, once revealed, it would force every person in that ballroom to confront the history they had spent generations trying to erase. The laughter from the engagement ball echoed across England long after the music ended. Within days, newspapers transformed the announcement into a national spectacle. Headlines questioned Anaya Rao's place among the aristocracy. Editorials mocked Duke Alexander Ashford's judgment. Cartoonists sketched exaggerated caricatures intended to humiliate them both. Drawing rooms buzzed with gossip. Country estates hosted entire evenings devoted to discussing the scandal. Anaya quickly learned that ridicule could travel farther than truth. Wherever she went, conversation stopped. Eyes followed her. Smiles carried hidden blades. Yet she refused to retreat. Every morning she rose with the same quiet determination that had carried her across an ocean. Every insult reminded her how much she had already survived. Compared to losing her parents, crossing continents alone, and escaping a forced marriage, aristocratic cruelty seemed small. Still it hurt. Some wounds reached places pride could not protect. Alexander saw the strain she tried to conceal. One afternoon he found her standing beside a rain-streaked window overlooking the city. She was watching people hurry through the streets below. "They hate what I represent," she said softly. Alexander stepped beside her. "No." She looked at him. "They hate what your existence reveals." The distinction mattered. Deep down he understood something Anaya did not yet see. Society's hostility had never truly been about her accent, her birthplace, or even her heritage. It was about fear. Fear that the stories powerful people told about themselves were not entirely true. Fear that privilege might not equal virtue. Fear that someone they dismissed could possess greater character than those born into titles. Those fears only intensified as their engagement continued. A coalition of influential aristocrats soon organized against them. Publicly they claimed concern for tradition. Privately they sought something much simpler. They wanted Anaya gone. Rumors appeared from nowhere. Anonymous letters accused her family of fraud. False witnesses emerged with contradictory stories. Old records were questioned. Every week brought another attempt to undermine her legitimacy. At first Anaya responded with patience. Eventually she stopped responding at all. Truth required no defense from panic. Yet while England focused on destroying her reputation, Alexander became increasingly consumed by a secret he had guarded for years. The secret waited inside a locked cabinet in his private study. One rainy evening, unable to ignore it any longer, he unlocked the cabinet and removed a collection of weathered boxes. Dust danced through candlelight as he carefully opened the first. Inside lay hundreds of letters. Some were folded neatly. Others had begun fading with age. All carried the handwriting of his grandfather. Alexander remembered discovering them shortly after inheriting the Ashford estate. At the time, grief had made reading difficult. He had sorted the documents, preserved them, and gradually explored their contents over several years. Among thousands of ordinary correspondences, one collection stood apart. The letters chronicled an extraordinary friendship. His grandfather, Lord Edward Ashford, had written extensively to a man named Anaya Rao. The two had met as young men decades earlier. One was English, one was Indian. Yet the letters revealed a bond stronger than geography, culture, or social expectation. They debated literature, discussed philosophy, shared dreams, comforted one another through losses. Their friendship survived years of distance and political turmoil. As Alexander reread the letters, familiar passages stirred old emotions. One described Edward defending Arjun against prejudice during a formal gathering. Another praised Arjun's generosity after he secretly financed aid for struggling communities. Again and again the same themes appeared: respect, loyalty, honor. The qualities Alexander admired most. Then came the final letters. Those had always affected him differently. The handwriting grew shakier. Ages weighed upon both men. Time was running out. In one letter, Edward confessed sorrow over the growing hostility dividing families and cultures that once shared affection. He feared future generations would inherit suspicion instead of understanding. Arjun responded with unexpected hope. He wrote that kindness could outlive hatred if enough people chose courage over comfort. The last exchange contained a promise. If their descendants ever crossed paths, they should restore the friendship others had tried to erase. Not because of obligation. Because some bridges deserved rebuilding. Alexander had never forgotten those words. Years later, when investigators first presented information about Anaya Rao, he experienced a shock unlike anything in memory. The surname captured his attention immediately. Further research confirmed what seemed impossible. Anaya was Arjun Rao's granddaughter. The woman standing alone in England carried the bloodline woven throughout those letters. At first Alexander viewed the discovery as remarkable coincidence. Then he met her. Everything changed. The kindness described in the letters existed within her. The resilience existed within her. The compassion existed within her. It was as though history had reached across generations and introduced two unfinished stories to one another. Yet Alexander told nobody. Not even Anaya. Part of him feared revealing the truth too soon. Another part wanted certainty before sharing something so significant. That hesitation would soon become impossible. The campaign against Anaya escalated dramatically when a formal investigation was announced. Government officials, legal experts, genealogists, and representatives of several noble families were assigned to examine every aspect of her claim. Newspapers celebrated the announcement. Critics predicted humiliation. Many expected the entire story to collapse. The investigation lasted weeks. Every document underwent scrutiny. Every signature was examined. Every date was verified. Witnesses traveled from India. Records arrived from archives. Lawyers searched relentlessly for inconsistencies. Anaya endured each hearing with remarkable composure. Alexander remained beside her throughout. Together they faced every accusation. Together they weathered every attack. Then the verdict arrived. The findings were unequivocal. The marriage records were authentic. The birth certificates were genuine. The family lineage was legitimate. Every claim Anaya had made proved true. For a brief moment she believed the battle might finally end. Instead the opposite occurred. Facts failed to change hearts determined to reject them. If anything, the hostility deepened. The aristocracy could no longer question her bloodline. Now they questioned her right to belong. One evening, after another exhausting day of public criticism, Alexander returned to his study and stared at the letters spread across his desk. The investigation had settled one argument. It had not solved the larger problem. England still refused to see Anaya clearly. His gaze settled upon the final letter written by his grandfather. A single sentence seemed to glow beneath the candlelight. Some truths arrive exactly when they are needed. Alexander slowly folded the letter and looked toward the darkened window. Beyond the glass, storm clouds gathered over London. Within days the grand coronation celebration would bring together the most powerful families in the country. They expected another opportunity to ridicule Anaya. They expected another public spectacle. What none of them knew was that the forgotten friendship they had buried for generations was about to step into the light, and when it did, the entire foundation of their prejudice would begin to crack. The grand coronation celebration arrived beneath a sky of polished silver clouds and restless anticipation. Across London, carriages lined crowded streets while aristocrats dressed in their finest garments and prepared for what many believed would be the most entertaining scandal of the season. Invitations to the event had become prized possessions. Everyone wanted to witness the downfall of Anaya Rao. Rumors traveled through drawing rooms and private clubs before the first guests even arrived. Some claimed new evidence would emerge. Others insisted powerful families had arranged one final humiliation. Many expected tears. Most expected defeat. Nobody expected truth. By evening, the ballroom blazed with light. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations above hundreds of guests. Gold leaf gleamed across towering walls. Musicians filled the air with elegant melodies while servants moved silently among the crowd carrying silver trays. Anaya entered beside Duke Alexander Ashford. The conversations did not stop. They simply changed direction. Whispers followed her instantly. Some guests stared openly. Others smiled with practiced politeness that failed to conceal contempt. Months earlier such attention would have unsettled her. Now it merely exhausted her. She had spent too long fighting for dignity to surrender it to strangers. Yet even she sensed something unusual in the atmosphere. Alexander seemed calmer than expected. Almost certain. His confidence contrasted sharply with the tension gripping the room. Several noblemen gathered near the central staircase, watching them with visible anticipation. Wealthy families who had spent months attacking Anaya's reputation exchanged satisfied glances. They appeared convinced the evening would finally restore the social order they believed she had disrupted. Alexander noticed every expression. He said nothing. Instead, he guided Anaya through the crowd and toward the front of the ballroom. "Whatever happens tonight," she said quietly, "thank you for standing beside me." His gaze softened. "There is nowhere else I would stand." Before she could respond, a bell rang from the far side of the hall. The music faded. Conversations dissolved. Guests gradually turned toward the elevated stage prepared for speeches and presentations. The evening's master of ceremonies stepped forward and welcomed the assembled nobles. Several dignitaries spoke briefly. Applause followed. More speeches came and went. Then the announcer unexpectedly called Alexander's name. A ripple of curiosity swept through the audience. Anaya looked at him in surprise. He squeezed her hand once. Then he stepped away. The ballroom watched as the Duke of Ashford disappeared through a side entrance and returned moments later carrying a weathered wooden box. It looked strangely ordinary amid so much luxury. Yet Alexander carried it with extraordinary care. The crowd exchanged puzzled glances. He placed the box upon a table at the center of the stage. For several seconds, silence lingered. Then he opened it. Inside rested stacks of old letters, journals, photographs, and bound documents preserved across generations. The audience leaned forward. Alexander removed a faded photograph first. Even from a distance, the image commanded attention. It showed two young men standing shoulder to shoulder. One was unmistakably English. The other was unmistakably Indian. Neither appeared concerned by the difference. "What you see before you," Alexander began, "is a friendship many people worked very hard to erase." The ballroom grew still. His voice carried effortlessly through the hall. "These men were my grandfather Edward Ashford and his closest friend Arjun Rao." Murmurs spread immediately. The surname caught everyone's attention. Alexander continued before anyone could interrupt. For decades they remained loyal to one another despite enormous pressure to abandon that friendship. They shared ideas, responsibilities, hardships, and dreams. Their letters survived. Their story survived. Unfortunately, our willingness to remember it did not. He lifted a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. The room remained silent. Alexander carefully unfolded one page. The paper trembled slightly with age. He began reading. The words described mutual respect, admiration, and gratitude. They spoke of courage rather than division, friendship rather than prejudice. More letters followed. Each revealed another piece of forgotten history. Anaya listened from below the stage, astonishment growing with every sentence. She had never heard these stories. She had never known her grandfather's name existed within the private history of the Ashford family. Around her, nobles shifted uneasily. The narrative unfolding before them challenged assumptions many had carried their entire lives. Alexander then opened a leather journal. My grandfather wrote something here shortly before his death. He turned several pages. The ballroom remained silent enough to hear paper moving. Then he read aloud. The measure of a person's worth cannot be found in birthplace, title, wealth, or blood. It is found in character. Arjun possesses more honor than many men who call themselves gentlemen. The words settled heavily across the room. No one laughed. No one whispered. For the first time, many seemed uncertain. Alexander closed the journal. His gaze swept across the audience. I have listened for months while people questioned Anaya's place among us. His voice hardened. I have watched educated men and women reduce her entire identity to the place she was born. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Then came the sentence that would echo through England for years. You laugh because she is Indian. I chose her because she represents everything this country claims to admire but too often forgets. The impact was immediate. The room seemed to freeze. Several faces paled. Others lowered their eyes. Anaya felt emotion rise unexpectedly within her chest. Not because he defended her. Because he understood her. The distinction mattered. Alexander reached into the wooden box once more. This time he withdrew ledgers and financial records. The audience looked confused. He placed them carefully upon the table. What I am about to reveal was never intended to become public knowledge. His expression grew solemn. For more than 40 years, Arjun Rao quietly funded schools, hospitals, orphanages, and relief programs throughout England. A wave of disbelief moved through the crowd. Several guests laughed nervously. Alexander did not. He opened the ledgers. Names, dates, amounts. Every contribution meticulously recorded. Every transaction verified. Every recipient documented. The laughter vanished. One by one he began naming institutions. Schools still operating. Hospitals still serving communities. Relief funds that had saved struggling towns during economic hardship. Many guests recognized the names immediately. Then Alexander revealed something even more shocking. Several noble families present had survived financial disasters generations earlier because anonymous benefactors stepped forward at crucial moments. The records identified that benefactor. Arjun Rao, Anaya's grandfather. The revelation struck like thunder. Expressions changed across the ballroom. Confusion became disbelief. Disbelief became shame. One elderly lord slowly sat down as though his strength had abandoned him. A woman who had publicly mocked Anaya weeks earlier stared at the documents with tears gathering in her eyes. The truth dismantled decades of prejudice within minutes. The people who had questioned Anaya's worth had unknowingly benefited from her family's generosity for generations. The irony was devastating. The silence that followed felt almost sacred. No one knew what to say. No one knew how to defend themselves. Anaya stood motionless. Images of her parents filled her thoughts. Her father's quiet dignity. Her mother's unwavering kindness. They had spent their lives carrying a history nobody acknowledged. Now the world finally saw it. Alexander descended from the stage and crossed the ballroom. Every eye followed him. When he reached Anaya, he offered his hand. She took it. For a long moment neither spoke. They did not need words. The truth surrounding them spoke loudly enough. Then something remarkable happened. A single person began applauding. The sound echoed across the hall. Another joined. Then another. Within moments the entire ballroom rose to its feet. The applause swelled like a storm. Not forced. Not polite. Genuine. Powerful. Unavoidable. Many guests clapped through tears. Others simply stood in stunned silence. Anaya felt emotion overwhelm her composure. For the first time since arriving in England, she was not being tolerated. She was being seen. Yet even as the applause thundered around them, Alexander's attention shifted briefly toward the wooden box resting on the stage. Hidden beneath the journals, letters, and financial records remained one final document he had not revealed. It contained a secret even Anaya did not know, a discovery connected not only to her grandfather but to her parents themselves. And as the crowd celebrated the restoration of one forgotten history, Alexander realized another astonishing truth was waiting to change their lives forever. The weeks following the coronation celebration transformed England in ways few people had expected. Newspapers that once mocked Anaya Rao now published lengthy accounts of her family's forgotten contributions. Historians began examining records long ignored in dusty archives. Schools discussed the story. Churches spoke about it. Ordinary people who had never met Anaya found themselves inspired by a woman who had crossed an ocean carrying little more than hope and courage. Yet the greatest change occurred within Anaya herself. For months she had fought to prove she belonged. Now she no longer felt the need. The truth had spoken louder than any defense she could have offered. When she married Duke Alexander Ashford beneath the soaring arches of St. George's Cathedral, thousands gathered outside despite the rain. Some traveled from distant counties simply to witness the ceremony. Others came because they believed they were seeing something larger than a royal wedding. They were witnessing reconciliation. As Anaya walked down the aisle, she carried her mother's silver locket hidden beneath her gown. The familiar weight against her heart reminded her that she had not reached that moment alone. Her parents were absent, yet they were everywhere. They lived in her courage. They lived in her choices. They lived in the values that had brought her there. Alexander saw tears glistening in her eyes when they exchanged vows. Without a word, he squeezed her hand. The gesture said everything. The wedding became the most discussed event in England, but neither Alexander nor Anaya allowed celebration to distract them from a deeper purpose. Many expected the new Duchess to seek revenge against those who had humiliated her. Others expected her to retreat into privilege. Instead, she surprised everyone. 3 months after the wedding, she announced the creation of the Ashford Rao Foundation. The project united wealth from both families and focused on opportunities for children who possessed talent but lacked resources. Scholarships were established. Libraries were built. Hospitals expanded. Orphan homes received funding. Teachers were hired. Books were distributed. Entire communities began changing. Whenever reporters asked why she worked so tirelessly, Anaya always gave the same answer. Because kindness built my future. I owe a future to others. Years passed. The foundation grew beyond anyone's expectations. Its influence reached villages across India and towns throughout England. Thousands of children received education that would otherwise have remained impossible. Families escaped poverty. Young minds discovered possibilities they had never imagined. The public gradually gave Anaya a new title. Not Duchess of Ashford, the Duchess of Two Worlds. At first she laughed when she heard it. Later she quietly embraced it. Because it felt true. She belonged to both places. Neither heritage diminished the other. Together they completed her. One crisp autumn morning, nearly 7 years after the wedding, a royal invitation arrived at Ashford Manor. A new wing of the National Museum was scheduled to open in London. The royal family requested their presence. The letter provided few details. Alexander seemed unusually pleased when he read it. Anaya noticed immediately. You know something I don't. His smile only widened. Perhaps. The answer irritated her enough to make him laugh. A week later they arrived at the museum. Crowds filled the grand entrance. Government officials, scholars, artists, and members of the royal household gathered beneath banners celebrating cultural unity and historical preservation. Anaya expected speeches. She expected exhibitions. Nothing more. The ceremony began normally. Several speakers discussed the importance of forgotten histories. Others praised cooperation between nations and communities. Then the museum director invited Anaya and Alexander to unveil the centerpiece of the new gallery. Confused, Anaya stepped forward. A massive curtain concealed something enormous. The director handed her a golden cord. This belongs to you, Your Grace. Anaya glanced toward Alexander. His expression softened. Pulling the cord slowly, she watched the curtain descend. The moment it touched the floor, the world seemed to stop. A giant portrait dominated the gallery wall. Not of a king. Not of a queen. Not of a famous general. Her breath caught. The portrait depicted her parents. Painted with extraordinary care, they stood exactly as she remembered them. Her father wore the same gentle expression that had comforted her throughout childhood. Her mother's eyes radiated the same warmth that had made every place feel like home. The gallery disappeared. The crowd disappeared. For several seconds only the portrait existed. Tears filled her eyes. Then they overflowed. All those years she had carried grief like a silent companion. Every achievement had been shadowed by the knowledge that the two people who deserved to see it most were gone. Now the world was honoring them. Not because they were nobles. Not because they were wealthy. But because they had raised a daughter whose courage changed lives. Anaya covered her mouth as emotion overwhelmed her. Alexander moved beside her immediately. The crowd respectfully remained silent. "They should have been here," she whispered. His eyes glistened. "They are." The gallery erupted into applause. Yet Anaya barely heard it. She continued looking at the portrait while memories flowed through her heart like sunlight through stained glass. For the first time since losing them, grief no longer felt like an open wound. It felt like love. Months later, Alexander revealed another surprise. He invited Anaya aboard a ship crossing the Indian Ocean. The journey stirred memories she had not visited in years. When the coastline finally appeared, emotion tightened her chest. Together they traveled inland. Roads became familiar. Landscapes awakened forgotten memories. Then they stopped before a house. Anaya froze. It was her childhood home. The same house she had fled during a storm so many years ago. The same house where her parents had laughed, worked, dreamed, and sacrificed. She turned toward Alexander. "How?" "I purchased it." Her eyes widened. "You bought it?" He nodded. "But not to own it." Workers emerged from the surrounding gardens. Children followed behind them. Teachers, historians, families. A newly carved sign stood near the entrance. "The Rao Ashford Heritage Museum." Anaya stared speechlessly. Alexander gently took her hands. "The place where your story began deserves to live forever." The museum opened several weeks later. Visitors arrived from across the world. Exhibits celebrated the friendship between the Ashfords and the Raos. Artifacts told stories of courage, compassion, and cultural unity. Children wandered through rooms where history felt personal instead of distant. Years later, on a warm evening bathed in golden sunlight, Anaya stood in the museum garden watching English and Indian children play together beneath flowering trees. Laughter drifted through the air. Friendships formed effortlessly. The divisions that once seemed impossible appeared strangely small. Alexander approached quietly. In his arms rested their newborn daughter. He carefully placed the child into Anaya's embrace. The baby wore two treasures. Around her neck hung an Ashford heirloom necklace. Around her tiny wrist rested her grandmother's Indian bracelet. A living bridge between generations. A symbol of everything their families had fought to preserve. Anaya looked toward the horizon as the setting sun painted the sky with gold and crimson. For a long moment she held her daughter close and listened to the joyful sounds surrounding her. The frightened young woman who had once crossed an ocean with a single suitcase was gone. In her place stood a wife, a mother, a duchess, and a woman who had united two worlds without abandoning either one. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she smiled toward the fading light. We finally came home. And for the first time in generations, both sides of her family truly had.